I'm just delighted to be here again today with Dr. Mark Solms and Dr. Michael Levin. Thank you both for being here. I did an extensive introduction to both of you on the previous conversation, so I'm going to put that in the show notes and we can save that time today for conversation. In our last talk together at the end, Dr. Solms mentioned that he was going to talk about his new project of artificial consciousness, and I know that was something that Dr. Levin was very interested in. And from now on, I'm going to call you Mark and Mike so that I don't get myself confused. A couple of things. Mark, I noticed that you had mentioned in the previous episode that affect is what you see as the fundamental aspect of consciousness. And you also mentioned in your book that unless it is possible to make a conscious machine, we will not have solved the hard problem of consciousness. So I know that's part of what you're working on. And then Mike, you had mentioned that you're looking at this new recasting of physics to perhaps see cognitive systems as a specific kind of predictive interaction with the outside world. So I thought we might kind of explore that in the context of what Mark is going to tell us about artificial consciousness. Does that sound okay?
Sure, sounds great.
Okay, let's go with it then. Mark, why don't you start?
Thanks. Well, thanks very much, Corinne. I'll start with the things that you just said, that I said, namely that, in fact, what I had in mind was Richard Feynman's famous statement, which was found on the blackboard after he died. So it's not exactly his last words, but something close to that. He said, "If I can't create it, I don't understand it." And I agree with that. I think that if you're going to claim to understand the causal mechanism whereby consciousness arises, then you should be able to engineer that mechanism. That, I think, is the ultimate test of a mechanistic account of consciousness. So it's for that reason that we have, I and a small team of colleagues. I better quickly mention them so as to be fair. It's not me alone. The team is headed by me and Jonathan Schock, who's a physicist and computer scientist. And then the other senior members of the team are Bruce Bassett, a physicist and computer scientist, Benjamin Rossman, a roboticist, Ryan Smith, a neuroscientist and computational, sort of, I don't know what to call him, computational mental scientist, and Charles van Hoof, who's a roboticist. And we've had a student, Rowan Hodson, who's been sort of at the coalface doing this work. So the other thing that you mentioned was that I believe that affect is the fundamental or elemental foundational form of consciousness. So I have to start there in order to explain the project that we're working on. The quest to identify a neural correlate of consciousness, famously associated with Francis Crick's work in the 90s with Christoph Koch, it focused mainly on visual consciousness and therefore on visual cortex. This was the sort of model example. If we can identify the neural correlate of visual consciousness, then we will have a basis for generalizing from there to other forms of consciousness. That's pretty much been the kind of mainstream approach. I don't mean that all of the work has been on vision, but it has all been on cortical processes and for the most part perceptual processes. And I thought that's the wrong place to start. And I don't have time to go into all of the details as to why I believe it's the wrong place to start. So I'll just say two things. The one is that cortical visual processing carries on perfectly well. I don't mean perfectly, but perfectly well. In other words, adequately without consciousness. There's lots of evidence for unconscious cortical visual processing. In other words, you don't have to be conscious in order to see. The evidence for this is tachistoscopic experiments where you flash for a few milliseconds visual information. The person is not aware of having seen anything at all, and yet you can demonstrate that what they've seen alters their behavior. Blind sight is another example. But for me, the most telling example, the most telling reason to believe that cortex is the wrong place to look is that if you study children who are born without a cerebral cortex, a condition known as hydranencephaly, they're conscious without any cortex at all, without ever having had any cortex at all. By which I mean they wake up in the morning and they go to sleep at night, and they are responsive and reactive. And in particular, they are emotionally reactive. In other words, affectively reactive. In other words, they demonstrate, they act as if they have feelings. So that suggests that consciousness doesn't require a cerebral cortex. The consciousness must be generated in the brain stem, which is all these children have. It's not possible that they could have visual consciousness because they don't have visual cortex or any form of perceptual consciousness or any form of higher cognitive consciousness at all. The evidence suggests all they have is raw feelings. That's as good a starting point as any for why I think that raw feeling is the most basic form of consciousness. There are all kinds of evolutionary stories you can tell as to why that also makes just common sense, that the dawn of consciousness wouldn't be some complicated cognitive reflective self-awareness. It would just be some sort of qualitative feeling state with survival consequences like pain or hunger or the like. So that's where I started. You could even say logically, you can have visual processing without visual consciousness, but you can't have feeling without feeling. The notion of an unconscious feeling is an oxymoron. The very meaning of the word is that you feel it. So if we're wanting to understand what consciousness does, we should be looking at this most basic form, this type of mental process, which seems to be for consciousness. It seems to require consciousness. Whatever this function is, whatever it's doing, it has to be felt. And so these are, had I more time, there's a lot more I could say, but these are the reasons why I focused on the brain stem and on raw affect, raw feeling as my. So now going back to Feynman's remark, what we're wanting to do is to say, well, what then is the mechanism, the causal mechanism, whereby feelings are generated in the brain stem? If we can identify that mechanism, we should be able to engineer it. That's the basis of the project that team that I named, that's the basis of the project that we are working on. So what is the mechanism of feeling? It seems to be homeostatic. It seems to be an extended form of homeostasis. When I said earlier, the dawn of consciousness probably involved the organism feeling something about how well or badly it's doing in relation to its survival imperatives. I'm speaking about an extended form of homeostasis. When I say well or badly in relation to survival imperatives, that mechanism is homeostasis. And incidentally, there's lots of evidence that the brainstem nuclei that we are talking about do in fact function homeostatically. So these are not just, I'm not speaking from first principles, I'm speaking about what we know about these structures. You stimulate these brainstem structures, you generate intense affects. Nothing of the kind happens in cortex. You image people who are in intense affective states, you see that the arousal is in those brainstem structures. In particular, I want to focus on the periaqueductal gray, which seems to be the sort of great assembly point for all of these homeostatic systems, all of the error signals, in other words, things going badly, all of the error signals converge on periaqueductal gray. So we're using the functional architecture of this part of the brain as the basis for the artificial consciousness that we are trying to develop. I must emphasize, I don't say that we are developing, because who knows whether we'll succeed or not. So we are trying. It's a kind of a test of whether or not we're anywhere like on the right track in terms of the sorts of things I've just said. So I won't reference all the time our last conversation, because presumably some of our listeners will not have heard our last conversation. So, but I know I did mention this last time. Not all homeostatic mechanisms are conscious. There's a hell of a lot of homeostatic regulation that goes on autonomically, of which we have no awareness. Blood pressure regulation is a clinically notorious example. You don't know about the undershoots and overshoots in your blood pressure until it's too late. But the example that I gave last time was in response to a comment Mike made, was that blood gas balance, normally it's regulated autonomically, but under certain circumstances, we do become aware of how well we're doing in terms of maintaining our blood gas balance. And that is under conditions of uncertainty, when we find ourselves in an unpredicted situation, like, for example, in a carbon dioxide filled room. At this point, when you suffer air hunger or suffocation distress, your need for oxygen comes very forcibly into consciousness. So that transition from an autonomic regulation of your blood gases to a conscious awareness of how well you're doing in terms of your need to balance carbon dioxide and oxygen. That transition occurs then because now the autonomic reflex is not enough. You have to do something allostatically in the outside world. And my hypothesis is that the coming into consciousness of your blood gas balance tells you how well you're doing in your choice making as you navigate this uncertain environment. If you move somewhere, you can't predict where the oxygen is. You've never been in a burning building before, let alone this particular one. If you happen to move by trial and error to where the oxygen is, you feel relief. And if you move where less oxygen is, you feel more respiratory distress. And so that feeling tells you how you're doing. So the basic mechanism is that feeling of increasing homeostatic error or decreasing homeostatic error. The organism being able to register here and now how well it's doing enables it to make choices. Choices have to be rooted in a value system. Good and bad feelings tell the organism those are our value system, and it's on this basis that we make our choices. It's on this basis that the whole of voluntary action is founded. So let me stop there and now summarize what the basic requirements for what are the basic ingredients for a conscious agent, given everything I've said. Because this was our strategy. We said, let us try to engineer the minimal conditions for a conscious agent based on the principles that I've just outlined. Let's try and make one. So the basic conditions are we're not obviously creating an organism. We're creating, so what are the minimal, what is the artificial equivalent? It's a self-organizing system. It's a system that is bounded. There's a boundary between the system and its environment, and it registers its own state. You can't speak of the system having a point of view unless you have those kind of basic conditions that I've just described. We call it a Markov blanket, the boundary that distinguishes between the system and the not system, and the system registers its own state and registers the state of its environment via the blanket, via the bound. So it registers its own blanket states, and that tells it something about. So there's a point of view. Now you have the sort of necessary preconditions for a self. I don't mean you have a self. I mean you have the necessary preconditions for. This justifies you to speak of the system's point of view. It enables. It becomes reasonable to put yourself in the observational position of the system. How are things going from the system's point of view? How well or badly it's doing in terms of its survival imperatives matters to such a system, because if it's doing badly, it's going to cease to exist. If it's doing well, it will continue to exist. So this is the next thing that we engineer into our system. It's a self-organizing Markov blanketed system, which has needs, survival needs. In the version of the system that we're working on now, it has three needs. The one is it has energy. It needs to replenish its energy resources. Secondly, in doing so, it bangs into things, and it suffers damage in the process. And there's a limit to how much damage is tolerable to the system before its structural integrity is undermined. And thirdly, it needs rest. While it rests, there is a repair of the structural damage that has occurred. So these are the three needs. In order for this system to continue to exist, it has to meet those three needs, and that's all that it's there for. It doesn't have any other purpose other than to keep going. And this is, by the way, I must emphasize, at this stage in our work, this is a simulated agent. In other words, it's not a robot. It's an agent that moves around in an artificial environment. We're developing the algorithms at this point for such a system.
Could I just clarify there for a second? You said it's not a robot, it's a system that moves around in an artificial environment. Are you talking about something similar to a more advanced cellular automaton that's just moving around in a software environment, or?
So it's a virtual environment. It's a large space. It's a grid. Located in that space are its resources. In other words, places where it can rest, and places where it can obtain its energy supplies, and places where it bangs into things. It knows nothing about that environment. It just has these three needs, and it wanders about this environment, discovering, inferring where it is in relation to what it needs, on the basis of the consequences for these homeostatic need detectors that I mentioned earlier. So we will embody this, but we've gone through many generations, as you can imagine, in the process of developing this. It's just impractical to do it otherwise than the way we're doing it so far. but there are very interesting things that arise at the stage when we're going to embody it, and I'll come to that in a moment. I want to, again, sorry, this is a mouthful. How long have I been speaking for? Much too long.
Well, maybe before you go on to the next step, Mike, did you have any questions in here before he goes on, or are you content to just hear the whole thing?
I'm content. I have plenty of questions and thoughts, but I'd love to hear the rest of this, and then I'll get going. Yeah.
So Mike will be familiar with some of these concepts, which sadly I don't have time to unpack all together, but this system, the basic, it's an active inference agent. It is inferring its own state, and it's inferring the state of its environment. In other words, it's making predictions about, if I do this, that's what will follow. To the extent that what it predicted will follow does not follow, to that extent there's an error signal, and it updates its predictive model accordingly. And so it's constantly improving its model of itself in its world, based entirely on its own experience, with these three imperatives that it has to meet. Those are its three homeostats. And it has increasing or decreasing confidence in its policies on the basis of how well it goes about satisfying its needs. I say confidence, I'm using the word, I know it's an ambiguous word, I'm using the word in the statistical sense. In other words, it attaches greater or less precision to its current policies. This is a confidence in the statistical sense of the word, but I rather like the ambiguity of the term, like the ambiguity of the term beliefs. The system has beliefs, the system makes decisions, the system has needs. All of these words are ambiguous, but I think appropriately so. Now, that's the basic thing that it's doing, but there are various complications. The one is that it's not expedient to only only function by trial and error. Error is dangerous. Banging into things is bad. Making bad judgment calls is bad for a system like this, because remember that basic affectivity, the valence, the goodness and badness, is rooted in these needs, which determine whether or not it's going to survive. And so there's an additional layer of functionality, which has to do not just with measuring its free energy. Sorry, I should pause here to say free energy, Karen, it very simply speaking, is its average error. So it's the extent to which its model does not adequately predict, it does not efficiently predict what it actually encounters. The free energy is a measure of that. So it's got to minimize its free energy. It's got to maximize the efficiency of its predictive model. But so that's where the goodness and badness of it all, it's rooted in the fact that increasing free energy just is bad from the point of view of the system, for the system. But that free energy is factorized across these three categories. And what's important about that is these are qualitatively distinctive categories. It's not just one continuous variable called free energy. So these needs are qualitatively distinctive from each other and must be treated so by the agent, by this artificial system that I'm speaking of. So it's registering how well it's doing across three different qualitative categories, with all of which have existential consequences for it. Now, the thing I was going to come to next is that over and above this trial and error way of going about meeting its needs, it also has the capacity to calculate its expected free energy. In other words, to look ahead. If I were to do this, what will happen to my free energy? If I were to do that, what would happen? And so this is something like working memory. It has something of the same functional capabilities as working memory, or thinking, if you will, thinking ahead. Thinking takes time, it doesn't have all the time. Of course, it's working against the clock because it's losing its energy supplies. It's increasing its rest needs. So thinking takes time. So it also has to think about thinking, as it were. In other words, it has to make decisions about how many time steps must I think ahead. At what point does it become inexpedient to do so? So it's got all of this functionality. Once it's learned how to survive in the environment, then what we do is we change the environment so that it now, what used to apply, it doesn't apply anymore. So it's returned to a state of uncertainty. And I again, remember the uncertainty, it's a crucial part of what I'm talking about. The confidence is determined by the affects. In other words, by how well or badly it's doing in relation to its needs. Its confidence in its current policy is modulated. It's tethered to the affects, but it's a matter of confidence in the policies that it's executing in the service of meeting the demands of these homeostatic need systems. So we change the environment, and then it's now back in a state of uncertainty. It has to learn once more how to survive in this environment, and then we change it back again. And then the system gradually learns these are like seasons. It's not random changes, they're regularities. And then lastly, we have a hill, which enables the system to disambiguate which season it's in. There's we spoke. I said I'm not going to talk about our last discussion, but I will once more. We spoke about opponent processes. This is this explore-exploit dichotomy. Sometimes going up onto the hill, which is an explore strategy, is better for its survival than exploiting. In other words, just going for where the resources are. So it has these. So it's got choices that it's making across: do I act? Do I think? Do I explore? Do I exploit? Never knowing whether it's in season A or it's in season B. Not never knowing, but using these are factors that it's got to take into account in its ongoing what I would dare to call in its ongoing voluntary behavior. In other words, in its ongoing navigating an uncertain environment and making choices based in the value system, ultimately rooted in its own survival needs. So that's where we are. That's what we've done. The next step in talking in this conversation now, I'm going to pause. I'm just going to say where I would go next if I didn't pause is to the crucial questions about how do we know when such a system in fact does have feelings. This is the single biggest problem that we face. And I've got various thoughts about that. None of them definitive, none of them entirely satisfactory. But I think this is the function. This is the engineering of the minimal functionality that we have inferred underlies raw feelings. Remember, we're talking here about artificial forms of feelings for an artificial agent. But I think that it's reasonable to speak about the point of view of this agent. And it's reasonable to start speculating about what is it like to be this agent. And that leads us to the problems that I say I'm pausing before we get to.
Well, I mean, so I must say, you've checked off almost all of my boxes as far as the kinds of things that I think are necessary to create such a thing, right? So I think we're in complete agreement on the origin of all of this in homeostasis, the critical nature of choices and preferences, the need to self-organize and construct a boundary between yourself and the outside world, right? That's not given to you by somebody else, but you have to construct this boundary, right? Active inference, the kind of basic metacognition of asking how are you doing, right? Your own checking your own state and being needy and vulnerable to damage and all of these things. I mean, this is like I 100% agree with all of that. I guess the two things I was thinking is, first of all, this question of what you said, for example, about blood chemistry or other aspects of the body that go on, non-consciously, right? So I think that's interesting, and I think it impacts the second thing, which is, of course, the critical part of how do we know about these systems, which is that view of these things being non-conscious are from a very particular perspective. That is from the perspective of you and me and the two sort of verbal consciousnesses that are having this discussion, right? From that perspective, of course, these things are, I have no idea what my liver is doing. I'm not conscious of it at all. But what I'm not at all sure of, in fact, I suspect this is that there is such a thing, is that these processes go on with some level of consciousness in a different self that exists within my organism that I, as the one doing the talking now, have no access to. But that doesn't mean it isn't conscious, right? It's not conscious to me. It's not in my field of consciousness. But I think actually that quite a number of the things that are going on in a body such as ours probably come with their own basic nonverbal kind of consciousness. We can't ask them for very reasons, obvious reasons, but we can gather some evidence that are similar to the evidence that we use to gauge each other's consciousness in terms of this, problem of other minds and things like that. And so I think it's, I think that we are not so this whole sort of construct has some number, maybe a large number of different selves in it, which I think all enjoy some type of consciousness that we would find very difficult to imagine or speak about. And I think that relates to this question which you had just sort of started on, which is, okay, so you've created this thing. It has all of the kind of basic requirements, and so now the question is, okay, so what criteria do we use now to know if the project has succeeded or not, right? I think this is really critical. And for me, I've come to the conclusion that as we think about competencies in spaces other than three-dimensional space, right? So we're very used to gauging, how do we solve the problem of other minds? Well, you look around and I see you, or I see some very clever animal or something like this behaving in three-dimensional space. And I say, okay, that's good enough for me to attribute all kinds of things on a practical level, attribute feelings and preferences and some, to have a theory of mind about it. And I think I've come to a position where looking at competencies in other spaces that are not three-dimensional space. So for example, physiological state space, right? Anatomical state space, transcriptional state space, other problem spaces. I see no reason, even though we are very bad at having a theory of mind in those spaces. We're good with three-dimensional medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds in sort of 3D space. We're very good at that for evolutionary reasons. Really not very good, I think, at recognizing this in other spaces. And I don't see any reason why all of these systems that have various competencies in those spaces might not have equally valid consciousness in those spaces. And so I guess I'll just end here and ask you, because I think here's where the two things kind of come together, is in your system, before you make the physical system, right? So in your virtual simulated world where your system matches all of these criteria, at that point, do you think that whatever level of consciousness it has is sort of as real, whatever that is, right? But as valid as the kind of consciousness that that physical creatures exhibit in three-dimensional space, right? So people, this is something that science fiction authors and computer scientists have been discussing for a really long time, right? If you live in a virtual world and you're a virtual creature, can you have a consciousness that has the same philosophical status as our consciousness? So what is your take on that? Do you think this is as real as it gets, or no?
The short answer is yes, and now let me unpack a bit of it. I absolutely accept your earlier statement about component systems within the system, and you spoke of selves, sort of component selves. I absolutely accept that. As you know, because you are familiar with this whole way of thinking, there isn't one Markov blanket. Right. There are blankets within blankets within blankets. The nervous system sort of provides a meta blanket but it's regulating all these other component systems. And my answer to that is, to the extent, remember what my starting point was in terms of the transition from autonomic regulation of blood gases to feeling suffocation alarm. The principle there for me is to do with choice, the requirement for choice. In other words, the uncertainty that the system has to compute in relation to its policies. This is something which I imagine in the most autonomically regulated systems, there will be minimal uncertainty. It doesn't mean there's none. There will be times when there's none. There might be moments of perturbation where uncertainty reappears. So I don't see it as a black and white dividing line. I think wherever the functionality I'm talking about, where the system or subsystem has to now navigate uncertainty and make choices, I'm saying that's what the mechanism of affect is for. So wherever we see that functionality, I'm willing to infer affect.
Mm-hmm.
The word affect speaks to your next question in one way. There are two ways in which I'd like to address your main question about three-dimensionality. The monitoring of blood gases is not a three-dimensional spatial business. And the same applies with our artificial agent. It's monitoring how am I doing it, for example, in relation to my energy needs. This is not about space. It's navigating a space in order to, it's having to exist within a three-dimensional spatial world. But what it's doing there is fundamentally driven by its monitoring of its own state. It's a measurement of its own state in a qualitative dimension. So for me, this goes to what I said at the beginning about our starting with visual consciousness as our model example. I think that's starting with this kind of representational cognitive consciousness. I think we should have started with something that has to do with the measurement of a state, something much more basic. But I think that the other way in which you're asking the question about virtual versus real agents, that's a terribly important question. And I'm afraid, I suspect or dare I say we, will lose the sympathy of many of our viewers and listeners when I say what I'm going to say now, which is that I think it doesn't make one jot of difference whether it's an embodied agent or it's a virtual agent, because this is what functionalism is all about. It's not about the substrate, it's about the mechanism. It's about so the computations that this agent is performing are every bit as real if it's embodied as if it's not embodied. So the mechanism I'm talking about, the mechanism that causally generates feeling like something, I think is perfectly possible in an entirely virtual agent. So when I said at the beginning we're doing it this way first, later we will embody it, I have to confess, I mean, I am interested in embodiment, and I'm interested in what new problems arise for the agent. I think that we need to take an empirical approach to that. But in principle, the real reason why I feel we need to do that is because of prejudice, because the people who are going to have to judge whether we have succeeded in our project or not, we're going to have three strokes against us if it's not a physically embodied agent, and that's the main reason, frankly speaking, that I want to embody it. And so, that leads.
I need to ask a question here, because when you are talking about the blood gases getting to a place where it rises up into the consciousness, and when you talk about that need that arises, that we become conscious of the need, right? That need is being instigated by the anomaly of the environment in which our blood gases get out of balance. And when Mike talks about Picasso tadpoles, he's created an anomaly that the tadpole moving into the frog state then has to adapt to that anomaly somehow. And it's in that adaptation, I think maybe when I'm hearing you, Mike, talk about these different levels where you can go down and find this aspect of consciousness, there has to be some way in which those tadpoles, the cells within the tadpoles, are navigating that problem that they're facing, that anomaly that you have injected into the system. If I move into a gas-filled room or something like that, that gas in that room is an unusual environment. And you talk, Mark, about creating unusual environments for your entity, whatever that is, to navigate, because that's part of the learning process, so to speak. That's part of the development. So how is it possible for this entity to face anomaly if it is not embodied? Unless it's just anomaly that you're creating for it. You're artificially producing anomalies for it to interact with. But if it's not embodied, how is it going to face anomalies that aren't being artificially injected into the system? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of morphogenesis, as you're talking about now, we have a system that lives in multiple worlds. It is embodied in that you can go and put your finger on the cells and where the atoms are and so on. But I think in a much more important sense, what it's doing is it's navigating morphospace, which is this virtual space of possible configurations of the face. And what we've done in that space, in the case of the frog, what we've done is we've moved the physical configuration, but we have not touched the encoding of the correct state, the set point, which is how the system knows that it's in the wrong state. And I mean, I think Mark laid out all the right steps that exactly is what it does. It's constantly monitoring itself against the set point. And in fact, we have a project where we literally look at the stress that goes up when the delta is too high. So the current state doesn't match the desired state. The stress of the system goes up. And so it absolutely knows where it is in morphospace and if it's in the right place or the wrong place. We have other systems where we've done the opposite, where we don't touch the cells. What we do is we change the set point, and then the cells, sure enough, will go and reconfigure themselves in something an observer might call a defect, but actually the cells are doing exactly what they're supposed to. They're building a completely different thing because we've rewritten the set point that they're using to gauge where they're supposed to go. So I'm in full agreement with Mark. I think that space is as good, that morphospace is as good as virtual space in terms of once you have an agent in there that's sophisticated enough to not only homeostatically solve the problem, but have a second order monitoring mechanism where it's actually has a degree of metacognition about how well it's doing and what should we do and all of that. I think that's as good. I mean, to me, and I know what you mean. I think, yeah, we'll lose some people here, but I think absolutely that's as good. That's absolutely as good.
The one way of trying to regain those people that we might have lost is to remind us all that we have the reality that we are interacting with is our own representation of that reality. So, this physical space that we're speaking about is our own generative model's representation of that space, and likewise of our own internal bodily states. These are nerve impulses which are representing those states to us. So, what actually lies behind the blanket is completely, it doesn't really register for the system. The system is only registering its representation of a reality that it has faith, if I may say, it has faith that there is some real reality beyond its representation of it, that it's not just living in a dream. But ironically, the phenomenal reality, the phenomenological reality for the system, the most real thing, as it were, is the stress that Mike was just speaking about. What the system is registering is stress about these other things which it's representing, which it's inferring are the causes of this affective state that it's in. The affective state is the it's a kind of turn up for the books, that the affective state, the thing that the behaviorists told us was a fiction, the affective state is, I think, as it were, empirically from the viewpoint of the system, the most real thing. It is the lived, or at least experienced, reality of the system.
Yeah.
No,
please
go ahead.
Well, I was going to bounce an idea off of you and see what you thought. I've been thinking about exactly these same issues, these kind of basic elements that have to be there. And one thing that I recently started thinking about is this notion that, okay, so we start off with basic homeostasis. So you have this thermostat that resists changes in the environment, right? And it does what it can to keep the environment constant via the cooling and the heating. But one thing it doesn't do is resist your attempts to change the set point. So in other words, at that level of existence, whatever the set point is, it's just going to do it. It offers no resistance to that. But in biology, organisms like that don't survive long because they will be exploited by cheaters and parasites and everything else. And so that means that evolution should be favoring the emergence of agents that not only have a set point and work towards it, but actually are monitoring that set point to see whether it's being altered or not. Now that leads to an interesting thing, and it's the distinction, and I can't recall if we talked about this last time or not, but it's the distinction between learning and being trained. The question is, can you tell who's on the other side of this, of whatever is happening to you at the moment, right? So if you're a cell and your a bioelectric state has been changed, can you in fact determine whether, yes, it's been changed because you're the one who changed it, because you want to be in another state for whatever reason, or was it changed because a parasite or a backpropagation training process or some engineer or somebody or a neighboring cell or that's trying to make you be part of a different tissue or cancer cell or whatever, somebody else changed it for you. So that seems to be evolutionarily, it seems that there should be a lot of pressure to get good at determining that sort of thing, which requires then a lot of metacognitive monitoring and a clear boundary and a clear definition of which are the things that I'm going to consider okay because they come from inside, whatever that is defined as, versus which are the things that I consider an attack as some sort of hack, something that may or may not have my best interests at heart because there's another agent on the other side of it. They have a different agenda, maybe, right? So I think that simple dynamic, it seems to me that simple dynamic sets up a real pressure to get very good at establishing that boundary that you talked about between the self and the outside world, and in particular monitoring all of the events that go on to try to determine their origin or which. So that in turn, taking it one step further, that is the basis of trying to identify the agency of various things that happened. Is it the dumb mechanical universe that's causing this, or is there a level of agency out there that's messing with me that I need to resist or overcome or something? So that, if that's present all the way at the beginning, one can easily sort of see how that would scale up in complexity and give rise to all of these kind of complex things that we enjoy, where we like to tell stories of responsibility and individuals doing things and selves having perduring properties and ownership of goals and memories and everything else. It seems to me that all of this boils down to this very simple survival need of resisting changes to your set point, right? In a kind of competitive world. Does any of this sound reasonable?
Yes, it all sounds reasonable. It's to start at the most basic level, which is not quite where you're taking us, but I think it needs to be said first. Of course, learning doesn't have to take place ontogenetically. There is also a learning by natural selection. And so that's probably how it starts. And for a very long time, it's probably the only way that such learning in terms of what is the ideal set point. And that's probably how it happens for eons of time. But of course, as soon as the agent has the capacity to make choices, distinctions, inferences about this during its own lifetime, then you have a massively increased adaptive advantage. So I'm quite happy to agree with you that it probably goes a very long way down that capacity. I think that what you're also touching on is a very crucial aspect missing from the system that we currently are working on, and that is that it's a hermit. You know, there's only one of them. So one of the things that we know we need to do in fairly short order is introduce other agents, conspecifics, and others into the same environment, so that it starts having to infer other agents and modeling the models of other agents in order to make the kinds of inferences that you're talking about, with all of their adaptive advantages. And I think that that's it's biologically a highly implausible situation, the one we have at the moment. An agent that is the only game in town. It's not really having to infer, learn how to infer the sorts of things that you're talking about. So that is one of the places we're going. I think that before we run out of time, let's spend a little bit of time talking about this problem of other minds. You know, how do you judge? How do you know when you've succeeded in engineering an artificial consciousness? How do we normally deal with the problem of other minds? The only way we can deal with it is inferential. You know, I can never observe Mike Levin's consciousness, so I can't know that it feels like anything to be him. But I'm pretty confident in my inference that he feels pretty much the same as I feel to myself. And so we have to remember that's our starting point. There's no way that you can directly observe the conscious states of any other agent, including other human beings, you know, let alone non-human creatures and organisms, and let alone artificial systems. So this is why I start with the precise definition of what I think the functional mechanism is. You know, that wherever I see evidence of that functional mechanism operating, that's one reason for me to be confident that it feels like something to be this system. You know, and I think that we're up against an enormous amount of prejudice when it comes to that sort of thing. So one of the ways in which, I mean, the only sort of truly empirical, when I say empirical, I mean, that's not the right word, truly objective, is something like the Turing test, you know, that we have to have judges who see this thing behaving and have to they have to do what I've just said. All that we can do is, you know, I'm a judge who's currently judging that Mike Levin is conscious. So we need to, that's a Turing test, you know, and we need to minimize the prejudice, which is why Turing developed the test in the way that he did, that you don't get to see who the agent is that you're interacting with. So the virtual agent that we currently have, one of the advantages of using a virtual agent is we can come up with all sorts of graphics where we can embody this agent in all sorts of bodies, which may be more or less you know, persuasive. It would be interesting to see to what extent does the judge attribute consciousness to the agent just on the basis of what it looks like. If it looks human, if it looks biological, if it looks non-biological but robot-like, as opposed to if it looks like just a cipher. You know, how much of our willingness to attribute feelings to the agent is determined simply by that. The most, you know, when I speak to my colleagues, my neuroscientific colleagues, about this problem of other minds and how we get around it, you know, I'm constantly astonished by how many of them hang their hat on reportability. They say, you know, if you can't report that you're conscious, there's no empirical criterion, and therefore even those children I spoke of, those hydranencephalic children who are so emotionally responsive, they say, I don't know if they're conscious. Because why? Because they can't tell me they are. You know, and so just to show how flimsy a criterion reportability is, imagine if what we did with our agent is all that it has to do, you know, is is have a little ticker tape which says, I am running out of energy supplies. I feel bad about that. I am getting tired. You know, it's meaningless. It would be the least persuasive piece of evidence as to what's going on. I would be much more persuaded by what it does, you know, what kinds of problems it's able to solve, and centrally, you know, to what extent it's able to navigate uncertainty, able to make decisions which save its bacon in situations that it's never been in before. So ultimately, we are going to rely on that. But there's some interesting things which I would just like to throw out. I'll just mention one of them. There are many that we don't have time, but I'll just mention one of them to see what you think of this, Mike. You know, the experiment with zebrafish. I guess you call them zebrafish. With the hedonic condition place preference behavior, that the fish hang out on this side of the tank because that's where the food is, until you put cocaine or nicotine or amphetamine or morphine on that side of the tank. Then they hang out there. So it's a hedonic condition place preference behavior there. Why would the fish go there? It's not good for the fish. It feels good, but it's not nutritional. In fact, it's actually harmful, those substances. So we're trying to come up with something like that for our agent, where we can show something like hedonic place preference, something that suggests that what's motivating the agent now is only a feeling. In fact, it's something like neurotic behavior. In other words, it's doing something that's not in its own best interest on the basis of feeling states alone. What do you think of that? Would that be a convincing criterion for you?
I mean, I think it's very interesting. For me, that works. In fact, we've done similar things in development where we've exposed developing and regenerating animals to things like SSRIs, other anxiolytics, and sure enough, I mean, the morphogenetic agent is quite capable of either hallucinating in morphospace or hanging out in regions of morphospace that it normally would never go to, because we've short-circuited this reward machinery. Either the motivation is gone or the stress is so low that it doesn't care anymore, and so the anatomy just basically goes all to heck. I mean, that absolutely works, and I think that's a very reasonable. I mean, I think much like many things of interest in this area, if somebody wanted to be a sort of micro reductionist about these things, I think somebody could say, well, what we've done in both of these cases is hijack the metacognitive machinery such that, what the drug basically does is it fools it into thinking that the things are good because it hijacks this like self-monitoring thing, right? So I mean, I'm not worried about it. That's, one can take that view of kind of that reductionist view of anything. But I think fundamentally it is about the motivations of the agent and what are the different ways to manipulate it, and that tell you something about the to improve your theory of mind, basically. Yeah, I think it's very reasonable.
Well, I know that you both have a hard stop at 10, so I'm just going to throw out one last question for you both to think about, and then if you think it would be an interesting thing to talk about, you can let me know later. And that is, Mark, you said that you're creating an agent that has no other purpose except to continue existing. So my biggest question about the beginning of life or the beginning of consciousness is, where does that desire to exist come from? So I'll just throw that out in the air. And
that's a small question, and I'm sure we could get that answered in the last 30 seconds. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me.
It was an interesting conversation, Mike, and there's nobody that I could expect to have a more worthwhile discussion of this topic with than you, and it certainly proved to be the case. My expectations were fulfilled. Thank you so much. And thank you for facilitating it, Karen.
Yeah. Thank you,
I'm just really excited that you could get together. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.